The social history of people with disabilities and people who represent ethno-linguistic minorities is very tangled in the United States and has large unhappy pieces to it. And the reasons are easily understood, that it used to be part of the calumny against ethnic minorities that they were not very smart, that they in fact suffered from intellectual deficiencies. And on the other hand, individuals with disabilities have long been treated as second-class citizens. So the tangle came from the fact that neither group and their advocates wanted to be associated with the other group. And that means that when we talk about disabilities and in the same breath talk about linguistic and ethnic minorities, that arouses a lot of feelings in people who have strong emotions about these things. So I want to set those aside, set those sort of socially induced concerns aside for a second, and let's just try to talk about both the sociology, the cognitive science, and maybe a little bit of the neuroscience associated with children that have extreme difficulty learning how to read. So I want to propose, just for our discussion today, that there are common cognitive problems and instructional solutions that may address both the innate learning disabilities of children that have learning disabilities, dyslexia, and the problems that learning to learn in English as a second language pose for many children who are second language learners. Now, I'm going to make the point that our population of second language learners in the United States is confounded with income class. So if you look at second language learners in Canada, for example, past their first years in school, they tend to catch up with their peers and they tend to do quite well, somewhat indistinguishable from native Canadians. But that's not the case in the United States, and the reason is not because Canadian teaching is so much better than American teaching. It's because our population in the United States tends to be largely lower social income classes, and there's a long history in science that associates the effects of poverty and educational outcomes. So if you look on the left-hand side here, you see some of the sort of the defining features of learning disabilities as we currently think about them. And the two main things is that there's a presumed innate neurodevelopmental factor that underlies the disability, and that it manifests itself in difficulty in learning sort of basic kinds of language skills and manipulations. And that these children also present as what we might call treatment resistors. That is, if you think of education, teaching as the treatment, that they tend to be poorly responsive to the core instruction that is provided in classrooms. And just as every teacher of English language learners knows that every lesson, no matter what the content, is really about English, then for children who have learning disabilities, every lesson is about learning and the use of language in learning. So it doesn't matter what the content is, that if they have language-related difficulties, language processing difficulties, they're going to have problems in all areas. On the other side, you see what seems to be the defining features or the current consensus about children who are English language learners, that their underachievement is presumed to be the result of inadequate educational opportunity or instruction. And I include in that claims that instilling cultural considerations into instruction would improve the outcomes for children who are English language learners, and that certainly may be true. But in general, the case is that their underachievement is thought to be related to just inadequate instruction. And they also are sometimes considered treatment resistors in the sense that core instruction seems not to be sufficient to eliminate or overcome whatever the achievement barriers are that they face. So what I'm going to propose here is that we could exchange these explanations of factors so that you could just as easily say about children with learning disabilities that they also have had inadequate educational opportunity or instruction, and inadequate given their cognitive circumstances. And you could say similarly about English language learners that they also have innate neurodevelopmental factors, not deficiencies, but there are innate neurodevelopmental factors that underlie their response to inadequate educational opportunity and instruction. So it makes us at least consider, for the practical purposes of identification and instruction, whether we're really making a distinction between the populations for sociological reasons or political reasons, or whether there really is some psychological good sense in thinking that way. The general research and treatment assumptions for children with learning disabilities are that they require an individualized cognitive assessment, because the etiology of their disability is presumed to be neurocognitive in nature, and that the treatment is individually tailored in principle, but in practice, teachers, both in special education and general education, tend to teach children as groups. General effectiveness of direct and specific, extensive and intensive instruction is clearly been shown to be effective, not only with children with learning disabilities. You see here there's a reported effect size of about 1 standard deviation, but that kind of instruction has proved to be effective with children whose underachievement is presumed to be related to their impoverished circumstances as well. And adding individually designed strategy and cognitive self-regulation training creates the possibility of effect sizes that are even larger. In English language learners, we think about this as requiring some kind of individualized language skills assessment, and the treatment is group tailored, although tailored skills may vary from individual to individual. Now, it isn't so sensible when you think about children who are learning how to operate in a second language, that their individual differences somehow take a back seat to their group similarities. The fact that all the children are in the same predicament of trying to learn English so that they can achieve in subject matter is not sufficient reason to think that you should avoid the individual differences that present themselves with the children. So part of the reason that we sort of go wrong when we think of language education for children who are second language learners is that we tend to think in these terms that the fact of their inability to speak English provides a sufficient common basis for instructing them, and that the individual differences that they present with are not so consequential. Well, it could be that that's not the case at all, and all I have to do is point to the fact that all children who are English language learners don't experience the same amount of difficulty in acquiring English or functioning in English. So there's controversy about the fundamental importance of basing instruction on cultural principles. This is not to take argument with arguments about equity and arguments about fair access or equality of opportunity or respect for culture and language background, but it isn't clear that we have good data to show that that instruction based upon that principle or based upon those principles is effective. And the research tends to show that when you provide, in general, what is called bilingual instruction, which is no longer permitted in California, the effect size is only about 1/3 of a standard deviation. And the term bilingual education covers a host of variations across classrooms and educational circumstances. So this is the circumstance we find ourselves in California. These are the academic progress index for children who are English learners, students with disabilities, and children who are considered socioeconomically disadvantaged from 2005 to 2011. So the first thing you can see here is that that the children who are classified as English learners by the state of California and those who are classified as socioeconomically disadvantaged don't look really very different from each other. And both of those groups perform significantly better than children who are considered disabled. Now understand that the classification of children as English learners or as socioeconomically disadvantaged disguises all the individual variations that may be important in instruction. Likewise, all the children that are considered disabled also are variable in their outcomes and performances and responsiveness. And so this only gives us a very gross idea about what the differences are. So you should not take the categorical argument very seriously. You shouldn't be thinking, oh, if I can categorize the child as this is where I expect them to perform. When children walk into the classroom, you have to greet them one at a time as they come in. You can't. They don't represent their class when they come in. So let's look at reading. Back in 2000, we wanted to settle the reading argument once and for all. Didn't work, of course, but we tried. And a national reading panel said quality instruction, effective instruction, instruction that had effective outcomes, should have at least these 5 components to them. And the first of these was phonemic awareness. That's the ability to hear, identify, and play with individual sounds or phonemes in spoken words. I wouldn't have said it quite that way, but from a neuro-linguistic perspective, it's quite a complicated achievement to be able to live in a language community and recognize that the stream of sound that you hear when people speak actually has a rule structure to it, so that it's composed of some smaller set of sounds that have only a psychological reality. Remember, there's no acoustical reality, there's no physical reality to phonemes. If you take well, we don't have tape recorders anymore, but if you had a tape recorder and you tried to sort of take the word cat and sort of clip the tape smaller and smaller to try to find where the C is and where the A is, where the T is, you could never find it because they don't exist in reality. They don't exist in physical reality. These are psychological categories that children in every language community learn, and they learn how to distinguish some broad class of actual sounds as phonemes, and different languages have different phonemes. So it is probably one of the big breakthroughs in the 1980s that children that perform poorly in tasks that require that they understand this phonemic structure to language are at a distinct disadvantage if they can't perform these mental manipulations of phonemes. And this turns out to be true even in languages that are not alphabetic. So even in Chinese, there are children, because of individual differences, who process phonemes not as adequately as other children, and their reading in Chinese, which is an ideographic language, not an alphabetic language, is affected by that fact. So what we know is this, that some children learn how to read effortlessly, and others, they learn easily no matter what method of instruction is used. So this is probably what's led to the great war that we've had since the 1950s about whether we should have one kind of instruction or another, because most children who are normal learners will learn under whatever method you use. And it's a testimony to the flexibility of our cognitive system that it's compensatory. So if you teach children one way, a normally developing child will use whatever information you provide to develop language skills, and if you take the same child and transplant them to another place and teach them a different way, they'll do the same thing. About 30% of children, though, struggle to learn how to read, and it's about equal for boys and girls, even though boys seem to show up more in the roles of children in special education. About 50% of all the students receiving special education are classified as learning disabled, and we'll talk more about that in a minute. Among children who are identified as learning disabled in the United States, children who are Hispanic and therefore have some Spanish-speaking background in their families at home, are identified at a much higher rate than children who are from other groups. Now, most children that have reading problems that we think of as being related to learning disabilities have problems at the word level of processing. So we think about reading as having two levels of processing. A word level, which is you see the word, you puzzle out what phonemes in the language are being represented, and the phonemes give you a kind of a clue to what the word may be, and you search your memory to find out if you've ever heard that word before and know what it means. And then you move on in the sentence. But there's also a level of processing that's related to the text as a whole, a kind of reasoning ability that's much more complex, that has to do with reasoning about the information that's in the text and being constrained in some way by the information that's in the text. So children who have learning disabilities don't do as poorly as everybody imagines they do at the comprehension level, because they make use of every possible clue that they can find in and around the text. And they are generally considered to be normally intelligent, so they bring all their resources to bear on trying to understand what the text is saying. Where they really get slowed down, though, is trying to deal with those individual words. So the standard model of reading was that if you acquire great fluency at the level of individual words, that it will follow naturally for you to become better at comprehending. And that's not necessarily the case, but it is the case that it may not be a sufficient condition for you to become a good reader. It is a necessary condition. So here's some work that was done by the Fuchses back in 2005, and it shows the difference in growth over time by children who show very low risk at early screening. That is, if you look at their abilities to do phonemic tasks, they show no risk, and you see that their growth in reading is normal. That is, for a year in school, they have about a year's worth of equivalent growth. Children who are screened as being at high risk because of their poor phonemic performance early in school do comparably less well. So the evidence has converged that our most valid and reliable predictors of risk for reading are print concepts, that is, knowing the letter names, early in kindergarten or even in preschool, phonological awareness about letter sounds, and then the rapid naming of letters, the ability to remember and recall the names of letters very quickly, and then word recognition beyond that. Now let's talk about English learners for a moment, and then we'll see how they sort of fit together. From the Preventing Reading Difficulties in Young Children report, we had these conclusions: that low English proficiency in Spanish-speaking English learners is a strong indication that the child is at risk for reading difficulty. Low English proficiency in Spanish-speaking English learners. So that needs to be qualified somewhat, because it depends obviously on how much exposure the child has had to instruction and what age of a child we're talking about. I'm going to tell you about a study that we did about 10 years ago that involved kindergartners who came to school who knew very little English. And their circumstances are quite different from somebody who is a newcomer who comes like in 5th grade and has already had 4 years of education in reading somewhere else. Low reading achievement is a widespread problem among Latino students, even when they're instructed and tested in Spanish. However, that generalization doesn't work when you talk about Latino students in Canada. And as I said earlier, the reason for that is not likely to be that the schools in Canada and the teachers are so much better than teachers in schools in the United States. The difference probably is that they represent a much more normalized distribution of income classes in Canada than they do in the United States. In other words, Canadians have a very strict immigration policy, which requires that you show evidence of education or employment before you can emigrate to Canada. United States, immigration is not as well controlled, and so you have people who are looking for life opportunities and employment opportunities who come across the border, and they often don't have very much education or or academic skills, which is part of the reason why it's difficult for them to find employment at home, and it's one of the reasons why they come to the United States. So the population of children that Snow and her colleagues were writing about here are not really equivalent across national borders. Linguistic differences are not solely responsible for this high degree of risk, and that's what I was just alluding to. And the role of co-occurring group risk factors, and here they recognize that school quality, home literacy, and socioeconomic status has to be considered. Well, also we know that the schools that children go to are not orthogonal to their social status, that schools in the United States are neighborhood schools, so they represent the socioeconomics of the neighborhood. So to develop second language literacy, instruction is a key component of reading, as it would be in first language literacy. Instruction in key components is necessary. That is, those 5 components that the National Reading Panel pulled out are the same. When I was making these kind of comments at a conference once, someone in the audience took exception and said, well, you know, when you learn how to read in Spanish, you don't learn to do phonetic decoding. You read by syllable. And not only that, the orthography in Spanish is considered transparent. That is, it maps to phonemes very reliably, so that children learn how to read totally differently if they're learning how to read back home in a Spanish-speaking country. Well, that's absolutely true. But it doesn't apply to learning how to read English, because English is not transparent orthography. It's a very opaque orthography. And if the children come with families who are themselves not very well educated, they don't get as much leverage from their family's education as children who are in higher income classes, regardless of family background. Individual differences contribute significantly. Well, this is the point that I'm making earlier, is that we get all caught up about thinking about these categories as if children who are English learners represent some homogeneous category of child. They don't. But just as truly, children who are considered learning disabled are also not all that homogeneous either. So we need to stop thinking about those things and start thinking about what are the functional realities about development and language acquisition for children based upon individual differences. Most assessments poorly estimate individual strengths and weaknesses. In California, the system that we use in the schools to assign children status as English learners or as English proficient learners is without much validity, and it has almost no reliability at all. It doesn't correlate with any reading outcomes that are important. So we make all kinds of decisions about placing children in instructional settings based upon how we've assessed their first language, and we're almost always engaged in an exercise that has no consequence at all educationally. Little evidence related to sociocultural variables and literacy achievement or development or home language experiences. There's little evidence that relates sociocultural variables on literacy achievement, but home language experiences can have an impact, positive impact. In one of our projects with Spanish-speaking kindergartners, some mothers came to us and asked if we could help them because they wanted their children to do well in learning how to speak English and to read in English. And they said that they didn't know how to do that because they themselves did not speak English and they themselves were not literate. And they were afraid, at least in the case of one mother, they were afraid to speak to their child in Spanish out of fear that somehow that was going to interfere with their child's acquisition of English skills. So we quickly disabused her of that idea, and we met with the parents and showed them how they could sit and have normal conversational interactions with their children over read material that their child was learning how to read, and that the parents had wealth of knowledge and experience that they could bring to bear that would enrich the children's vocabulary, their concepts, and their family cultural history. This is the things that have been called cultural capital, and these mothers didn't think they had any, so we tried to show them that they actually did, and that not only was it going to be a good child-mother experience, but they actually would be helping their child learn language skills that would transfer to English. So language minority learners who enter kindergarten and are fluent in English at the time they enter kindergarten, catch up with their native English speakers by first grade, and maintain nationally average levels through eighth grade. But language minority learners with initially limited English proficiency demonstrated English reading trajectories that are substantially below national averages, as I showed you from the California data, but converge with those of peers from similar socioeconomic backgrounds, which was in that first graph I showed you. So here's a study that was done by one of our UC professors that are involved in this UC-wide center that Robin was mentioning, Rolanda O'Connor down at UC Riverside. She's just done this massive 3-year project working in Riverside schools, Riverside County schools. So here's what she found after working with these kids for quite a long while. That earlier intervention produced significantly better outcomes than the same interventions begun later in kindergarten. Well, that makes sense. Similar rates of growth between students who were English only or English learners. That is, it didn't matter what their official school status was about their English proficiency, that they learned at similar rates. Twice as many students in the immediate as in the delayed treatment scored in the average range at the end of the year. Well, that sort of fits with the idea about proficiency early on. If you tend to be proficient early on, you tend to do better. Pre-test did not predict good or poor responders to treatment. So testing the children early on did not tell them who was going to respond to instruction. By January, letter knowledge and phonemic awareness were reliably better for good versus poor responders. So that's what really made the difference between the children that responded well to instruction was their ability to have letter knowledge and phonemic awareness. So this is California data and data from my project that we began back in 2000. So let me tell you just a little bit about this. We had about 376 children, almost all of whom were English language learners, almost all of whom had family languages in Spanish. And the red line here represents the 8 years of data that we have now. We actually worked with these children only for the first 3 years, kindergarten, first and second grade. And then we found them again when they entered high school. And we went back and we got all of their California achievement test data from the years that we were not in contact with them. So that's what that red line represents. The blue line represents how California students generally performed over the last 5 years, or 6 years. And the green line represents how children who are classified as English learners in the same school district where we had been working with these children, how they performed over the same period of time. So before I show you what we did with them, let me take a step sideways and show you something about the instructional method that we used, because it bears on the problem of similarities and differences between these populations. We called this model a core intervention model. And it's based upon, it's a collection of pieces that we quilted together from various sources. Its theoretical origin comes from what's called cognitive load theory. Cognitive load refers to the demand that an academic response places on both structural and processing limitations that children have. All children have some structural and processing limitations. You cannot attend to many things at the same time. You cannot hold information in your memory for very long periods of time without doing something with it. And everybody has those processing limitations. Some people are much more efficient at using that system than others. But every child comes to school with some individual configuration of those limitations. Specifically, we're going to be interested here in the working memory system, which has certain constraints in that capacity is generally created only by greater efficiency. So you have a certain ability. Think of it as a sort of a bucket of a certain size, but you can fill it and empty it at different rates. And really skilled children can fill it and empty it really quickly, and children who are not so skilled or have other kinds of constraining characteristics are very slow at filling it and very slow at emptying it. And not only that, the bucket's got holes in it. So it's very difficult for them to perform fast enough on some kinds of processing tasks to be able to learn normal reading skills and other kinds of skills without considerable more instructional effort. So efficiency in turn develops as a product of natural maturation. So efficiency comes just from being in the environment, using language, and experience, including you growing up in a family where people chat with each other. We know for many years now that the vocabulary size of children who are entering school is markedly smaller in children who come from homes that are impoverished compared to children who are raised in homes that are middle-class homes. And also instruction. So instruction actually matters here. Now this is an old map of what was taken to be a working memory system, first proposed by Baddeley so many years ago now. This particular chart came from a more recent article when he was revising his model. But it's a very simple kind of system, and it's based upon experimental results. So there's no neurology involved in this. There's no brain imaging involved. This is just years and years of behavioral studies where the best explanation for that behavioral data comes from a model that looks like this. And in this working memory model, you have two major features. You have something that is designed by evolution to handle phonological information. That's something that has evolved in us as a species. It's not a skill that has to be developed. It's a hardwired part of the cognitive system. And as you will see, it's probably also a hardwired part of the actual physical brain too. And that there's a separate system that is a visual, which he called a visual spatial sketchpad, which performs a similar function. These are both systems that hold information of the two different types for very short periods of time, while you're deciding whether or not whether this information needs to be placed in some kind of long-term storage or whether you need to use it in order to solve some sort of problem. Both of these systems are considered slave systems. In other words, they don't operate on their own, they're being controlled. And the controlling mechanism he called the central executive. So you can't increase the amount of capacity you have, but you can do things more efficiently, as I said. So one of the things that saves you a great deal of time is if you can represent phonological information very rapidly. If you have built-in codes that you've learned for, let's say, the first sound that you hear in the word cat, if you can identify that, which constitutes a sort of a coding scheme, if you can identify that really quickly, and that code is stable, then that makes it easier for you to deal with the rest of the sounds in the word, and also makes you a little more efficient at searching your memory for a little furry creature with whiskers. So we developed, based upon that idea, we developed an intervention that borrowed from some sources that you'll recognize from direct instruction, developed at the University of Oregon almost 50 years ago, from systems of least prompts, which is used regularly in behavioral therapies. The concept here is that we want the child to be able to solve the problem and be correct. And we want to be able to appropriately reinforce the child for correct responses, but we also want to be able to control the cognitive load that is associated with the responding. So the first thing that we ask the child is what's called a generator supply question. The generator supply question represents the level of performance that persuades you that the child understands the underlying concept or the underlying instructional target. I mean, if I want the child to read the word cat, the supply question is the exact performance that we take as the criterion of proficiency. So we might show the child the word cat and say, what is this word? So the child has to be able to perform all the cognitive functions necessary to be able to respond, that word says cat. If the child doesn't get it correct, we step down this staircase by reducing the load and turning the problem into a problem of recognition rather than recall. Recall requires the use of this heavy use of the short-term memory system, this working memory system, whereas recognition does not. So now we might say to the child, is this word cat or cut? And that would be a fairly difficult discrimination for the child. But we can make the discrimination very broad too, so that the child's chances, whether we stack the cards in the child's favor, we say, does this word say cat or hippopotamus? So the child's likely to say, what, are you kidding? I can't be hippopotamus. First of all, hippopotamus is a big word, and that's a little word, so it must be cat. So if the child says cat, we say, yeah, good job, that's right. And then we go back up to the supply question. We say, so what is this word? So the child says, what, are you dumb? You just told me the word was cat, so it still must be cat, so it's cat. And then we say, yeah, that's right, that's good. If the child gets it wrong, then we go to a model lead step. The model lead step is just as it sounds. The instructor models the exact response and then leads the child in providing that response. So you have the whole complex response, whatever it may be, modeled for the child, and the child has a chance to imitate that model. So you would say something like, this word says cat. What does this word say? So the child just heard you say, this word is cat. So the child models that. This word imitates that, this word is cat. If they get it right, they're told how bright they are, and they go back up to the binary step. So if you walk down the staircase, you have to walk back up the staircase. So they go to the binary step, and the binary step says, well, is this word cat or cut? The child remembers now that they said cat, and they're looking at it, and they say, well, it's cat. That's right. Good job. What is this word? It's cat. It's still cat. Yes, that's right. If the child misses it at the model lead step, then we go down to a very simple imitation, which reduces the cognitive load as low as possible. And we say cat. And the child says cat. So it's the simplest possible imitation, the simplest, the lightest amount of cognitive load that we can impose that will provide that answer. So let me show you an example of this being used in practice. You're going to see Dr. Alexis Filippini, who's the director of the Mission Learning Center in San Francisco. She's teaching these children, these English learners, the word frightened.
2, 1. Okay. All right, well, you have to show everybody.
Oh, that's the title.
What is the scary man doing in this picture? Misael. Show the picture. You're right. And what's the big word we learned for scary? Is it frightens or snuggles? Cielo. Oh, good. What's her new word?
Snuggles.
Is it frightens? Good. What is it? Good. So tell me what the word is, Jeanette. And tell me what frightens means, Cielo.
When the snow falls and covers the ground.
Somebody is scared.
Right. To be frightened is to be scared. Tell me it.
So first of all, she establishes the concept, which is by using a known synonym. She says to them, what is that scary man doing in this picture? So by using scary, she's working towards a meaning for frightened, so she's showing them a word that they know, using a word that they know already. She uses a hand signal to focus their attention and to prepare them for a response. So she doesn't drop her hand until she really wants them to respond, and she surprises the person she calls on so that they don't know who's going to be called on. And she uses the hand signal also to give them some think time too. So she surprises them with a selection, she reinforces the correct response, and she continues without a delay. So when the child gets it right, she says, you're right. And then she builds from the known concept, scary, to the new word frightened. She says, what's the big word we learned for scared? She does her behavior management while she's teaching, so the hand signals and the visual monitoring, surprise turns, taking and moving distracting objects, moving at a rapid pace, all serves to hold children's attention. She says, is it frightened or is it snuggles? So here she's using that binary choice step where she's emphasizing for them, highlighting for them, and prompting them for the word frightened. So she gives a delay here, which is the think time, and she provides a little drama so they don't know who she's going to call on. The student says frightened. She reinforces the correct response. Oh, good. Quick follow-up with the same question to another student in the group. The student thinks the answer is snuggles. So now she does this imitation-modeling step, or at least Alexis's version of it, and she says, is it frightened? And the child doesn't say anything, and so she quickly, the child does say something, and she quickly repeats it. She says, what is it? So she's back up now to the supply question. And then she moves on to a definitional question. Who knows what frightened means? And that's the part at which we cut the tape. So what this question sequence accomplished, it established that students know the concept. It links new word to known word. It helps students recognize the correct word. It provides pronunciation practice through repeating, and it tests with an open-ended definitional question. The entire sequence, which was two vocabulary concepts, 5 questions, 5 student responses, plus individual student practice and group auditing, and all the necessary behavior management to maintain attention and engagement, took 45 seconds. So we designed this method to be efficient so that we could do interventions at the clip of 15 to 20 minutes with groups of 3 to 5 students, and that it would have the desired effect of teaching some defined set of items, exemplars. So we're testing them here on word analysis, which is to look at a pseudo word that has no meaning, and the child is forced to do all of the phonemic processing in order to be able to pronounce it. And then word identification, which is the recognition of words that they actually recognize and know. So this is how they performed over 4 grades on the word analysis test, which is reading these pseudo words, which is the gold standard test for being able to assess phonemic awareness. And the green circle up here, this represents how monolinguals are expected to perform at that same grade level. And this is how they did on the word identification task, which is much more related to the words that they encounter randomly in class and through instruction. And again, this is the level where most normally achieving monolinguals would perform at that grade level. So we went back over the 8 years using 8 years of data rather than just the 3 years that we had to see how well the students did over those years. And in fact, we verified that the growth path that the children took between kindergarten and first grade was as we had depicted it, that they made a big gain as they went through first grade, and they got their first instruction that helped them match alphabet letters to sounds and to begin to decode unknown words. And then they grew throughout the years that followed up to 8th grade with some regress between 5th grade and 6th grade for reasons that we just don't understand. Well, these are the entire cohort of children divided into quintiles. And so the group that we actually intervened with was the bottom performing 20%. That's this red group here. And then you can see that you got the next lowest and the mid group and the high and the highest group. So these kids performed, these were the top 20% performing kids in kindergarten, and this is how they looked over the course of these 6 years. So these are data that we did not collect. This is state of California data. So what's a little disheartening about this? We'll tell you the heartening news first. The heartening news is everybody improved over time. The disheartening news is that the quintiles that we identified in kindergarten never changed. So we weren't teaching them anymore, and we only worked with them for a very short period of time anyhow. They were receiving a treatment, to be sure. The treatment they were receiving was education. in the school, the core instruction in the school. So if you think about what the teachers are supposed to be providing in the school as the treatment was not mixing up the relative risk factors associated with these kids from kindergarten. And the teachers knew about these kids, and we know that for two reasons. One is that when we pick the kids, especially the ones in the bottom quintile, we ask the teachers to also rate all the children in their classroom based upon their overall judgment about how much difficulty the child was having acquiring new reading skills. And the teachers' judgments about the children and our judgments based upon data were overlapped about 80%. And to make it even more clear, this decade of data here was the decade of No Child Left Behind, where schools were very specifically mandated to pay attention to the low-performing children and close the gap between those children and other children. So this school district, at least, was markedly unsuccessful in altering the risks faced by the lowest performing kids. So the word attack skills in kindergarten were correlated with the standardized English language arts California state testing scores in third grade for both groups. So how well they could read words, pseudo words, these were pronounceable strings of letters, were not real words, was correlated with how they did on the actual English language curriculum standards test that the state gave to the children throughout the 5 years that followed. That means that the ability to do that phonemic decoding is a critical skill and a critical predictor of how you're going to do in very globally in English language arts. So it's not just reading, it's listening, writing, etc. The development of the word attack skills from kindergarten to second grade, which were the years that we were working with them, were correlated with third grade English language arts scores, but only for the non-intervention group. So only the higher achieving kids did that relationship exist between K2 and third grade. Intervention in kindergarten was not correlated with third grade skills or later development, suggesting that the intervention did not have a long-term effect. Well, we never designed this with the idea that we were going to influence how they performed in 8th grade. We were really trying to make it easier for them to learn things in 1st grade and 2nd grade. The variances of all the growth factors were significant, suggesting that the intra-individual differences in both initial skills and development within each of the interventions, that everybody improved. So that was what you could just visually see in the chart, that everybody got better, but they stayed in sort of parallel growth paths. So here you have the intervention and the non-intervention groups for the first couple of years on the left side. This is until spring of their 2nd grade year. And this is the intervention group. You can see that they caught up by the time they were in 2nd grade. But these are the grades after. So they lost whatever they were showing in terms of word level processing here, did not affect at all their progress in what is really text level processing, that is comprehension and other kinds of reading activities sampled across the curriculum for all those other years. So in other words, we were actively working to make the kids better. Here the school was doing what we would presume was trying to make the kids better, but really didn't. There's just some technical data about the analysis. There was a lot of error, that's what this designates as a lot of error associated with our estimates of the English language arts scores, and that's because the California English language arts standards test covers a broad range of language skills. It's not just reading and it's not just word reading, it's all kinds of reading related skills. So that introduces some variation into the scores that we had that makes it more difficult for us to have confidence in the growth path that we estimated. And here we can see that there was in fact clearly a difference, at least in those first 3 years, between the growth paths for the kids that had intervention versus the kids that did not have intervention. And these are parameters that are simply related to the growth path between kindergarten and second grade, which you could see in the graph. So the summary is that if you think of school as a treatment, that is the core general education instruction, short-term interventions in early grades do not produce long-term results. Well, those weren't expected. You have to continually work with that low-achieving group of kids. You can't just inoculate them when they're kindergartners and expect that they're going to be better afterwards. And despite school awareness and a decade of policy-stimulated focus on low achievement, the schools were not very effective in changing the 8-year risk status of our sample. So let's go back to learning disabilities for a second and see what's happening in the states and how what we're thinking about in learning disabilities is beginning to slowly slide together with how we think about English learners. So these are the identification rates in the early years, and you can see that from the passage of the first special education law in 1975, you had this dramatic increase in the percentage of school-age children. Up above 5% of school-age children were identified as learning disabled. But look at the last 10 years. This is from 1999 to 2009. And although the percentage of children that are identified for special education has been stable, and as you all know, the percentage of children identified as having autism has increased. Now that may not look like a dramatic increase, but that is a dramatic increase. And during that same period of time, the percentage of children that were identified as learning disabled has dropped from its late 1990s high down almost a full percentage point. So what has happened that has caused those children not to be identified, and what consequences does it have for kids who are English language learners? Well, we've learned a lot more about learning disabilities while all of this was happening. One of the things that we've learned for sure is that there are a number of perinatal events that are strongly indicated in the likelihood of developing learning disabilities, and maybe these are disabilities that may be induced by environmental events. When I say environmental events, I don't necessarily mean everything outside of your skin. I mean everything that is outside of your chromosome constitutes an environmental event. And in this particular case, we are talking about gestational events. And here you have children that are born at very low birth weight. So you have over 9% of children that are born at low birth weight have learning disabilities as compared to 4% of the population. And then the other, here's children that have learning disabilities and ADHD. It's still a large number, but not quite as much. And children that have ADHD only. But in each case, the message is clear that whatever the gestational events are that lead to low birth weight, significant low birth weight, has a consequence for the emergence of later learning disabilities. In this study, this national study, shows the percentage of children that have between none and 5 significant markers for healthcare needs over their developmental period. And so this is pretty dramatic because the more of these markers that you have, the more dramatically learning disabilities is evidenced. So this is children with none of these special healthcare needs, and that was at that time, that was about the population rate of identification. But as you add in these other healthcare needs, the percentage of children that are expected to have learning disabilities increases quite dramatically over their lifespan. Same thing is true about poverty. So here you have children that are less than 100% of the federal poverty level, even though the 5% is the national figure for special education. 14% of children who are below the federal census standard for poverty have learning disabilities. And as you increase family income, you can see that the function decreases predictably. So overall, the prevalence among 6 million children for children that have learning disabilities was about 9% in the overall prevalence in the population. For children that had significant healthcare needs, it was 27.8%, and for children that don't have significant healthcare needs, it was the population rate of 5.4%. So the system that underlies the cognitive development of working memory capabilities, working memory efficiencies, is part of a developmental sequence of skills that are indicated by children's performance on tasks related to the manipulation of phonemes. And there's no reason to believe that system, that cognitive system, is any different for children that are learning a second language. Well, we have now brain imaging studies that we didn't have back in the early days, and it helps us to sort out whether we're looking at a sociological phenomenon or a cognitive neuroscience phenomenon. This was a study that was done by Paul Su and his colleagues some years back, and I think it's probably the most important study that was done on learning disabilities in the latter part of the 20th century. They investigated individuals who were adults at the time they tested them. These were college students who had histories of learning disabilities in England and France. And Italy tended not to identify children as learning disabled. Why? Because Italian, like Spanish, is a transparent orthography, and most children learn how to read without very overt difficulty. But when they tested these children on those indicators which would mark them as learning disabled in France and the UK and the United States, they were able to identify, out of a very large sample of students, they were able to find a group of students who had profiles of performance that looked quite the same. So these are effect sizes for these different tests, and let me just point out a few things like there's comprehension. So this is the difference between, in each country, the difference between the children who are not learning disabled, not dyslexic, and those that are. So you can see that in each of the countries, the comprehension was better, but just slightly better. That's in keeping with the idea that they have compensatory skills that make up for their comprehension difficulties. But when you look at things like digit span, which is one of the marker tests for working memory, huge difference in performance, similar with arithmetic, mental arithmetic, across the three countries, despite the differences in the transparency of the orthography and despite the difference in the identification of school identification of children with dyslexia. Similarly, if you look at their word reading ability, so even though the Italian kids were never picked out as kids, as children, they were never picked out as learning disabled, their performance is still significantly below that of their peers in the same language group. And so word reading and non-word reading, which as I mentioned earlier was the gold standard of reading non-words that are pronounceable, hugely demarcates these dyslexic groups, English, Italian, and French-speaking groups, from their peers who are not dyslexic. So this picture, what they did here was they took functional magnetic resonance images of the brains, and these represent sort of effect sizes, if you like. This represents the summary of all of the non-dyslexic kids in the countries across nationalities. And this one represents the same kind of image for all the dyslexic kids across the three nationalities. And this one is the most interesting because this represents the subtraction of the dyslexic activation from the activation by the non-dyslexics across the three nationalities. So the sum result of this study and why it's so important was that this is not a sociological phenomenon. This is something that is really in the nervous systems of the children, and that the same areas of the brain are implicated due to unexpected non-activation for each of the groups of putative dyslexic, independent of the kind of language that they spoke and independent of the kind of reading system that the ease of the reading system that they learned in. So now we're good enough that we can now do studies where we have interventions, and we use the fMRI data as one of the tests of the intervention effects. So this was one of the first studies that was done that looked at both behavioral outcomes as well as neurological outcomes. By this time, there's about 20 such studies that exist. There are not yet any studies that I'm aware of that have looked similarly at children who are English language learners and low achieving, and similarly low achieving children who are identified as dyslexic. So, if somebody wants to be famous, go out and do that study. But this study was interesting because it first of all, it replicated what we saw in the Palliser study, that it showed for the normal reader across the top, when you're looking at the left hemisphere, you're looking at activation where you saw it in the superior temporal lobe there, just like you did in the Palliser study. And this is a particular case, but of all their cases, they had, I think they had 8 non-dyslexic and 8 dyslexic kids. The pattern was very much the same. The color differences here, I think, represent the time course of the activation. So the orange is the later activation, and the yellow is the earlier activation. But here by contrast, you have the dyslexic child representing a group of 8 kids with very little activation late in the course of response to the word reading stimuli. So they had an intervention though. So here you have the dyslexic kid before the intervention and after the intervention. So this is a teaching intervention, nothing medical or neurological, just an instructional intervention that was geared to improve the ability to manipulate phonemes. So you notice here that the activation now is quite similar to that, even extravagant compared to that of the children who are not dyslexic. And another example over on this side. This is kindergarten. This are the at-risk kids in kindergarten, and they're non-disabled or non-at-risk peers. That's actually the same information. This was important because in this study, what they plotted was, I told you that the red blotches showed later activation. So if you're looking just at the superior temporal lobe, which is the part that lights up the most, you can see that the peak activation occurs after about 600 to 700 milliseconds for the not at-risk kids. For the at-risk kids, there's no activation there at all, even though they've had plenty of time to sort of process the stimulus information. This was the one I was referring to, which was the kindergarten versus first grade. So here's the kindergarten non-activation across the superior part of the temporal lobe, and here it is after the intervention in first grade, showing that the effects are actually long-lasting in nature. They're not simply practice effects where the kids got better. Let me sort of sum up where I am with this, and then I'll like to hear your thoughts and questions. If it's true that poverty has developmental consequences for the development of language skills, and if children who are English language learners in the United States are disproportionately living in low-income families and therefore exposed to the same income-related risks or economic-related risks, then it's logical for us to presume that there is at least the possibility, the testable hypothesis, that there are structural and processing difficulties that those children are experiencing in the early grades in the same, not only the same working memory system, but the same areas of the brain that subserve that working memory system. And that we can see that the instructional interventions that are effective with kids that have dyslexia are equally effective with the kids that are simply low performing and are putatively at risk. And if that's the case, then we have every reason to believe that the intervention is influencing the same processing regions of the brain and the same underlying cognitive system. So we have difficulty organizing the schools towards that inference. And the reason is because we want to think about children with learning disabilities as having some kind of defective brain. And we want to think about children who are English learners as having no brain differences, but only differences that are related to sort of socio-cultural discrimination. So although sociocultural discrimination may be true, and although some kind of, I wouldn't say damage in neural pathways, but some kind of insufficiency in neural pathways may be true for children with learning disabilities, there are individual differences within both groups. And the real test of the similarity of those differences lies in the children's responsiveness to the instruction that you provide. So now that we have a clear picture of how the brain is responding to the same instruction, we have a better way of knowing about whether we're classifying children correctly or not. If it was not the fact that we classify children to receive certain services or certain kinds of resources, this wouldn't be an issue. We would simply provide additional instruction for kids that didn't do well. But there's something to be learned, I think, about the underlying processes of language and the environmental circumstances beginning at conception, the environmental circumstances that affect the growth trajectories of different children.
The UC Davis Mind Institute was created in 1998 with a promise to find cures for neurodevelopmental disorders. Every day, our physicians and researchers come closer to fulfilling that promise. Their groundbreaking research on autism, Fragile X syndrome, chromosome 22q11.2 deletion syndrome, ADHD, and other brain disorders are helping children achieve their fullest potential. Please visit our website to find out more about current studies, upcoming events, and how you can help make a difference.